Hello, everyone. Welcome. I'm Suzanne O'Keefe. I'm Communication Director of the Public Banking Institute, and I am helping today. Carlos Marroquin, who is scheduled to be our moderator today, has an emergency and cannot make it. So I am delighted here to have our beautiful guests today who are going to have an amazing conversation with you about something that's incredibly important to discuss at this time. I'm going to bring them on. This is PBI Live. We are in this is a new live stream show. This is episode number 2, and we are looking at current events from the lens of public banking and explaining how this situation could be different with public banks. Today this episode is public banks versus redlining. And we have 2 important guests, and I will introduce them. Let me bring them on camera. Our first guest is Brian Rice. Brian is an entrepreneur and engineer who had been redlined essentially for financing he was looking for to redevelop and upgrade properties in his hometown of Birmingham, Alabama. We also have Dr. Amara Enyia. She comes in. Here she is. And Dr. Amara Enyia was a candidate for mayor of Chicago, and she's also has lots of other important efforts that she's been doing, and she is very much well-versed in the impact that public banks could have on communities and how this situation could be different. So Brian, I would like to ask you to just recap a little bit of your story, and we'll go from there.
Well, definitely thank you for the opportunity to speak today. My story is not unique, and which is the reason why I felt the need to send a letter to Congresswoman Maxine Waters over the U.S. House and Finance and Banking Committee. I bought 8 historic buildings a little bit over 2 years ago, and make a long story short, 8 months later, every 2 weeks, the bank would ask me to submit new documents, and every 2 weeks they asked me to submit new documents again, and instead of just saying no, they just kept delaying me. So once I picked up on that, I just kept tracking everything. Make a long story short, when it was all said and done, I had 8 commercial buildings valued at $0. They only gave me value for the land at $1.04 a square foot for the land. And in my case, they compared my historic commercial buildings, which is in the Ensley community of Birmingham, to farmland about 14 miles or so away. And then they also compared my 8 buildings to an abandoned car wash about 10 miles away. And the sad part about it, when I spoke up about this publicly, a lot of public leaders also was mad at me for speaking out against redlining in my situation.
Yes, I was shocked to read the details in BBC News, but as Ellen Brown pointed out to me, our chair, this has been going on for a long time, and it is very, even today when all of this is happening, it is still happening. And Amara, could you give us some perspective on that historical issue?
Yeah, I think, first of all, I'm really excited to talk to Brian and also understanding that his story is one of many across the country. There's this notion that redlining and some of the discriminatory practices of traditional financial institutions like banks has ended 30 years ago or 50 years ago, 60 years ago, when in fact that's not the case. And so Brian's story really hits home because you see, obviously, and I would love to hear more about some of what, Brian, what you were looking to do with the properties in Alabama. But this is one example of how discriminatory practices have significant economic impact, particularly on Black people. And it also underscores the need for systemic structural changes to our economy to address that, because over the last several decades, what we've seen is a continued increase in the racial wealth gap. I know that there was a study that came out here in Chicago just maybe a couple of months ago that showed the disparity in lending, in home lending. So just as an example, this study found that one particular bank lent more to one predominantly white neighborhood in Chicago than all of Chicago's predominantly Black neighborhoods combined. So this is not something that happens on accident, and it's not something that is a relic of the past. It's actually current practices that are being carried out by traditional financial institutions. And so what we're really talking about is, how do we address that? How do we implement systemic changes that can make sure that folks like Brian can actually do what they set out to do, which is beneficial to the community at large as well, not even just him as an individual. So I'm actually curious to hear more from Brian about sort of what your vision was with the properties that you were looking to obtain, and how this situation, how did it alter the vision, or how did you have to navigate around it?
Well, I just want to let you know the vision is not dead. The dream is not dead. Every day I come to Inslee, and since the BBC article broke, I've had people reaching out to me all over the country as well as all over the world, trying to figure out how to help me in Birmingham, Alabama, which is I'm super thankful for. So my vision for the 8 buildings was to create spaces where entrepreneurs can develop. I want to make sure there is a space dedicated to women entrepreneurs, where there may be 10 to 20 office space in there. But then I also want to make sure there's a conference room set up in there to where we're constantly hosting entrepreneurship workshops, things like that. But the reason why that one is important to me is because when I lived in Houston and in Charlotte and Richmond, Virginia, as well as Milwaukee, before I came back to Birmingham, Alabama, every community I ever went to, whenever I go to the community center, I never saw a place for young women to develop. So I believe that if we can create a space for professional women to develop entrepreneurially, then now we have a space on Thursday or Friday to host mentoring sessions for young ladies in the community. One of the other things I want to make sure we put here is we have to bring healthy foods to this community. Since I came over here, I've eaten more bad food over the last 2 years than I have eaten in probably the last 10 years because the options are not here. So I want to make sure there's at least one meat and 3 style restaurant, but then I want to make sure there's a place for a pop-up restaurant where local startup chefs can develop and get off the ground, and they don't have to worry about that crazy overhead. The other thing is a space for construction contractors. In Birmingham, we are not developing our African-American tradesmen and craftsmen, as well as our those in the world of construction. We have very few that can go after anything over $5 million or $10 million. And for that reason, I believe we need to create a hub around that. And then now there's a few other things, everything from creative space for artists, creative space for videographers, podcasting, YouTube. But the most important thing is creating a place where we focus on entrepreneurship development and workforce development while mixing in offices and businesses we need in our community.
So it's definitely a bold vision.
Oh, yes. Why not?
Right, exactly. Bold is good. And it's also comprehensive. And one of the things that really is so critical to this conversation is that these are the things that really enhance the quality of life for folks down where you are in Birmingham. And also it creates opportunities. So you mentioned having opportunities for women to be able to move into entrepreneurship. And one of the things that you wanted to do with the building was to create that kind of space. The issue of food access is a huge one. I don't know if your eating habits changed because of COVID or maybe it's just a little bit harder to access quality foods. But the issue of food access and food security is a huge one, particularly in places where food deserts exist and not having access to a grocery store. So that's another part of enhancing the quality of life. And so when you come in with this big vision, and we haven't even gotten to your background, because some people will say, well, maybe his credit's not good, or maybe there's some other technical reason why he wasn't approved. But can you talk a little bit more about sort of your financial background and why that component of it is such a significant part of the pain of the denial by the bank?
Okay, well, definitely, thank you. So, what is so important is to know that is how they redlined me in my appraisal. My background is 15 plus years of engineering. And the last several years, over last 10 years, I was focusing on business development as a business development manager, but selling engineering and construction services. And I got my real estate license over 10 years ago. And so, I'm making, I think I was averaging somewhere around $100,000 a year around that time. And then at the same time, I had 5 tenants when I first bought the building, and there were 4 tenants when the appraisal took place. Now, this is critical. I had a bank president come over here trying to give me advice or just wanted to hear my story about 2 weeks ago. And I didn't even notice this a year ago. But in the appraisal company, which is the largest appraisal company in the country, which is CB Richard Ellis, they did not count any of my active income in the appraisal. So it made it look like my buildings were vacant. I had 4 tenants, and I always told them, calculate my loan or my construction loan off of the tenants that are there, and they make sure that wasn't there. So that one's probably worse than the actual fact that they compared me to farmland and to an abandoned car wash. It's just super bad. So it was so intentional. And right at the time, I remember about 5 months or so earlier, they said, "Oh, your credit score needs to go up about 9 points." So, I came back to them about 2 months later, and my credit went up about 20 or 30 points. And then I went back, and they said everything was good. So I was, I don't mind being open. At that time, I was roughly a 684, but with 100% paid off building, figure salary, and additional tenants bringing in income at the time. So I was more than qualified. I really wish they would have just came up with some basic reason to deny me versus using this redlining appraisal. But at the end of the day, we're going to help a lot of other people because we're going to bring light to this in Birmingham as well as in other cities across the country. And that's why I emailed Maxine Waters.
Awesome. I'm really glad that you're talking in detail about some of those technical hurdles that were placed in front of you, because there are viewers who might tune in and say, oh, well, maybe it was the credit score. Maybe he didn't have, the salary wasn't up to par. Maybe it was all of these things. And so just as you set forth, you pretty much met all the requirements, but the appraisal process and comparing you to farmland or an abandoned car wash, that's a huge issue that I don't know that people are as aware of. And speaking on this issue of appraisals, there was a study in the Brookings Institution put forth in 2018, and it was actually an article that reiterated the fact most recently in the New York Times, and it talked about Black homeowners and how their homes are appraised when they're looking to sell. And so what happened in this particular story that was shared in the New York Times is that a family, it was an interracial family, so Black wife, white husband. And when they initially put their home on the market, it was were putting their home on the market, the appraisal came in around $330,000, I think. Well, they ended up taking all of the pictures that showed any Black people or Black cultural indicators in the home. They removed all of that. And the second appraisal, it appraised for much higher, maybe about $45,000.
No, it was more. It went from $330,000 to $465,000.
Exactly, $465,000. Thank you. So as you can see, there is a huge disparity just by the fact that they took out the cultural artifacts and the pictures and things that would show that it was a Black family there. And so you can imagine scaling that across the country and look at how that would impact Black wealth, how that impacts lending. If you're, whether home buyer or even home seller, on both sides of that equation, there is a significant impact. And so your story kind of fits right within that framework in terms of how your appraisal experience was, which to me, it seems like it was pretty similar, even though you were operating in the commercial space. But that's something that I'm not sure people around the country are aware of, or if they have that experience, are they talking to each other about it? So are they sharing that? So even for you, do you have colleagues or friends or even family who have gone through a similar experience, or are you the one that's sort of the first one sort of sharing your story?
Well, I'm just glad I had the dream of coming back to my hometown, and that dream is what's driving me to come back and do all I can to restore this block, and then I have plans for additional blocks, and then I have plans for the residential community. So it's that dream that keeps me moving forward, and that's the reason why I'm going to fight like crazy. What I learned when I came here, I just turned 40 about a month ago. And because when I came here, I helped relaunch the Inslee Merchants Association, the Business Alliance, and there are probably over 30 other African-American owners in this immediate area. And they probably own anywhere from 50 or more buildings. I've only learned of one that's ever gotten a traditional loan in the last 30 to 40 years. So immediately, almost across the street from me, there's a lady who had 80% of the cash to renovate her building about 10 or 15 years ago, and the bank said they can't give her the 20%. And then a block or so up from me, a construction company got a line of credit to restore the building, but the local bank would not let them refinance and get into a better loan. And just a block away from that, there's another person who went to a major bank in this city, and they said your building has no value. The reason why I'm mentioning this is because those who have come before me just accepted it as normal and just dealt with the frustration. If they did not have 100% of their own cash, these buildings never got restored. So when you're in our communities and you say, why are there broken windows there? Why is that building sitting that way? They never had access to capital. And I've had people from New Orleans to Newark to Philadelphia, Los Angeles, as well as some other places, reach out to me since the BBC article broke and said the same thing has happened to me, but in a different way. So it is too common.
This is just such a aggravating story to hear. I can't even imagine what it has been like to experience. I'm just getting really upset about it. So Amara, maybe if you could please let us know how a public bank that's owned by the people, that's owned by the communities, make a real difference here.
Sure, and that's again going back to structural and systemic solutions to some of the challenges that we face, especially in your case, going back to your old neighborhood, going back to give back and really do some good there. And this is why this public banking conversation is so important. So the experience with private financial institutions is pretty par for the course, largely because, as we just spent the last few minutes talking about, the issues of existing discrimination, but also because of the difference in mission between your traditional financial institutions and public banks. So one of the biggest differences, and this is for all of the viewers who might be tuning in and wondering, well, what would be the difference with a public bank? Is that a private bank, their bottom line goal is profit. They have a responsibility to shareholders, and so the decisions that are made are with the shareholders in mind and with profit in mind. And so they are unwilling to take perhaps risks, but also they've gotten away with a lot with years of discriminatory practices that have become baked into their business model. And this is why this issue of redlining, disparity in lending persists. The focus and the mission of a public bank is to ensure a strong economy. So whether it's a state-owned bank, similar to the Bank of North Dakota, or if it's a municipal bank, the goal is a strong economy. And so what a public bank does is its allegiance is to the taxpayers. It is to the residents. And the goal is to make sure that the residents can actually benefit from the tax dollars that they are paying into the public system. And that makes the able to lend things like, if you're an entrepreneur, small business loans, home loans, many different, it can take different forms. Infrastructure is a big expenditure for cities and for states where we're spending billions of dollars on infrastructure projects. And if you know about these kind of projects, the interest rates can sometimes be 40 to 50% over the cost of the project. And all of that money is just being essentially taken out of the economy. Whereas with a public bank, that money is actually recirculated into the economy. They're not charging super high interest rates. They are designed to take on additional risk because there's a public interest in people like Brian Rice who decide that they want to come back to their communities, invest in their communities, build up their communities. There's a public issue making sure that he gets the capital that he needs to be able to do that. And so that is where public banks step in. They're able to take on some of the risk that private banks have refused to take on. And they are able to do it because there's an interest in having more small business owners, more small businesses in an area, more people being able to buy homes, more people being able to, municipalities or cities being able to have lower cost infrastructure projects. So you're not spending taxpayer dollars exorbitantly. These are the things that make the difference. Now, one question that comes up is from a lot of people, they'll say, well, what about community banks? Isn't that the role? And so, Brian, I actually wanted to ask you before I sort of touch on the relationship between public banks and community banks, if there are community banks in the area where you are, and if you had attempted to go through that avenue as a source of financing for your project.
We have, I don't know if you refer this as a community bank, but we do have several CDFIs here in the Birmingham market. But we do not have any public banking options. I don't think anywhere right there smack dab in the middle of the South. So I did go to a CDFI, but the interest rate was higher than I wanted. So I said, why should I have to take a higher than normal interest rate? And that's the reason why I chose not to focus on them. But then I also was referred to this company from a friend who had utilized them before. But then now it lets me know why he was able to get resources from them and maybe not me. He's actually a banker for a living, even though it's not with that company. But that's probably why he never had an issue before. So no, I never went to a community bank. I did go to several other banks. One of them told me at the very beginning, due to speculative financing, we're not able to move forward. Another one I went to, we talked, ready to move forward, went and talked to his manager, and I never heard from him again. So it just, it's unfortunate.
Very much so. And that's something that would be helpful for everyone to really understand is the relationship between public banks and community development financial institutions, which were created to sort of step in the gap left by traditional banks. But what a public bank actually is able to do is to support the lending capacity of CDFIs. So if you have a public bank at the state level, it actually allows for those CDFIs to be able to lend more. Or community banks to be able to lend more. So a lot of times you'll hear there may be a misconception about competition, like a public bank is competing with community banks or CDFIs, and it's actually not. It actually supports those institutions and it creates a much healthier ecosystem. And something else that is absolutely critical to note, and I'm sure this is the case down in Alabama, but traditional banks have actually constricted or they've lessened their lending. They reduced their lending in the pandemic. So we know what happened with the PPP program, the first round, and who actually got access to the loans that were made available by the federal government. Well, it was the people who had the best relationships with the large financial institutions that were pushed to the front of the line and got the big loans. Meanwhile, most of the small business owners, mom and pop shops, some of them didn't even hear back from the banks that they even have relationships with. And so in a pandemic where everyone is struggling and so many people lost their jobs and businesses have had to shut down, that can be disastrous. And so you're actually seeing how they had exacerbated the economic challenges. Well, a public bank actually does the opposite. In a time of, well, this is unprecedented. So this is the first pandemic, at least, of this magnitude that we're experiencing. But public banks can actually step in and actually lend more. And so you saw in Germany, for example, they almost didn't skip a beat in lending with their businesses because they were able to step in as opposed to sort of closing the doors and restricting lending.
Got it. Well, I'll definitely share a couple thoughts. In that article with BBC World News, I don't know if it was Andre Perry that posted this or it was one of the other people in that article, but it said what in 1863, African Americans, own like 1% of the wealth in the country at that time. And still today, we're still right around that 1% number.
Yep.
And I'll just use Birmingham for an example. In Birmingham, Alabama, for African American businesses, and this is why this is important to me, African American businesses make up less than 2% of all sales tax in a city that is 74% African American. Wow. That lets me know that this has been intentional for 40, 50, 60, 100 years. And it's not just Birmingham. If you go around the country and you start looking at other areas, you'll see the same thing. I went to Atlanta just a week and a half ago to get some inspiration. So I went to the Black Historic District, Auburn Avenue. Mm-hmm. And I actually was so sad and so frustrated when I saw the amount of buildings that was dilapidated in the middle of what we call the Black Mecca in America. And even in Atlanta, the African American Historic District, it looked like it might have been 40 to 60% of the buildings were in disrepair. And to me, that lets me know that we are not doing it right anywhere in this country. And we have to figure out how to invest in our communities. We have to figure out how to build up our entrepreneurs, build up the workforce, and we have to redirect our money back to our communities and build up our areas so we can, improve the lives of our communities.
You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. And it can't be stressed enough. The economic circumstances is especially if we're looking at predominantly Black communities, is probably the biggest challenge that we're facing. And when you look at, for example, buildings that haven't been rehabbed or that are fallen into disrepair, when you look at abandoned storefronts or boarded up storefronts, all of that is untapped potential. It's also revenue that's not being generated. And so it affects quality of life. I think for what we are looking to do is we know that the traditional banks have not lived up to their promise. And I don't know what's happened in Birmingham, and maybe you have some insight into that, but I know in the initial stages of a lot of the civil unrest that's been happening around the country, all of a sudden you started hearing traditional banks saying, oh, we're going to set aside $1 billion to help with small businesses or Black businesses, or we're going to set aside a fund for $300 million to assist with small business growth in Black communities. And those are sort of Band-Aid efforts that are being made, especially when you consider that many of these institutions have historically not lent to Black communities, have historically discriminated, have historically used redlining to keep that capital from flowing into these communities. And so even as we're calling that out, we also can't rely on their benevolence or a change of heart to magically come about, which is why we've really been pushing on establishing this public banking ecosystem here to really increase the flow of capital into the communities that need it most.
I got a question. So since I noticed here in the middle of the South, there's no public banking locations here. What would it take to do that? What kind of advocacy need to be done to make that happen?
Oh, I'm glad you asked. So we're at a time where this is really caught on across the country. In many cities and states around the country, groups have pulled together and they actually are drafting legislation. They are putting the building blocks together for public banks, either at the state level or the city level in their locales. And so we've got in California, New York, we did a town hall actually with a group of New York senators and assemblymen and assemblywomen as they draft legislation, and they're trying to push that through and get support. In Illinois, we had legislation on the books that was actually proposed at the state level. It got stalled for a little bit, but there's still some folks who are pushing. So really what it takes is a group of committed people who say, they've had enough of the economic circumstances and they want to push for systemic solutions. And what the Public Banking Institute has been able to do is assist with town halls, assist with getting the word out, assist with some of the grassroots organizing work that's necessary to get that collective together, and also help with legislation. So finding elected officials in your state or in your city that might be friendly to such legislation, and then moving the ball that way. This is the sort of work that we've really been doing, the Public Banking Institute has been doing, because we know what the issues are, but it's about, okay, how do we get the solutions and how do we push those solutions into the mainstream? So that's sort of what it takes. And also, people have questions. How do you start a bank? How is it capitalized? We are able to answer a lot of those questions too, because they might think, well, you've got to have, $100 billion of liquid capital just lying around to be able to capitalize it. And that's actually not the case. Most cities, I'm sure it's probably the same in Birmingham as well, they keep the tax dollars, the tax revenue that they get in depositories. So maybe they keep them in maybe the bank that you got denied from, they might have their money in those depositories. So it's a matter of shifting it from there to an actual public bank. And then that way you can ensure that those dollars are actually used in the interests of the community and in the interests of people like yourself. But the Public Banking Institute is very committed to helping in that process and really helping for different groups around the country who decide that they've had enough of the status quo and they're looking to implement better solutions to address the needs, especially of our communities.
Definitely, I think it'd be awesome, to get more options anywhere. But I also think in the meantime, it's very important to, keep the pressure on our public leaders all the way from Congress to Senate to the local mayors and city councilmen. Because when I started studying my case and I was preparing to send my letter to Maxine Waters, the Congresswoman Maxine Waters, I realized that, the Supreme Court gave cities the right to sue banks for predatory lending. I also realized that in Philadelphia, in Maryland, and I think it was in New York, the attorney generals in those states launched redlining investigations where it was open, to anybody in that area to send in these 10 or 15 things that have happened to you. And if they put, at least do the reviews, I know it takes time to do it, but do the reviews and launch this nationally. For example, the fact that CB Richard Ellis or CBRE is the largest appraisal company in the country. If they can compare me to farmland in Alabama and an abandoned car wash in Alabama and ignore my funding of my rent roll in my buildings, how many other people do they do this to across the country? You'll see my voice start crackling when I think about this, because it's not about me. It's too many other people who have not been able to develop their properties, put their businesses there, improve the life of their families. And they can launch an investigation against them, because since they're everywhere, they can start with them. And then with the Bank for Me, they can start with them. And I'll use an example out of Greensboro, which I learned about recently. It was on Boyce Watkins. There was a couple well over $1 million. Credit was not the concern. I think they were probably close to an 800 credit score. And they were denied for a very small loan in comparison to the wealth that they have. And the judge threw their case out in Greensboro, North Carolina, because they did not prove that they were Black. And it is using any of these, unfortunate rules laws to get around this stuff. And there's too many stories of a person look up people with 800 credit scores and 700 credit scores and, bringing in 100,000, 200,000 more of capital a year of them being denied because of the color of their skin. We need our congressmen and women, senators and others to speak up. We have to improve our communities.
Yeah, absolutely right. And I think that the enthusiasm and the passion that you have is so both refreshing, but it also underscores why this is so important. We cannot afford another year of the economic circumstances that we're seeing. We certainly cannot afford to be waiting around for 5, 10, 20 years, hoping that banks that private banks and Wall Street banks magically decide that they want to do things differently. And this is why we're pushing so aggressively to create much more awareness about the role that public banks can play to addressing a lot of those issues of discrimination, which are very prevalent now. And I keep saying it because people will say, well, redlining is a thing of the past, or discrimination or racism those are things that happened a long time ago. But Brian, you're just naming so many stories and examples of people who can check all the boxes and who have everything that you would need to be able to access capital and are still being denied. So if that's the case for people who have all of the qualifications that you could imagine, then what do we think about most regular folks who do have visions and who do have dreams for what they can do in their community, and also who don't have access to wealthy relatives who can front them $50,000 or $100,000 to start up their business? This is the reality of what it means in this country to try to get access to capital, to try to do better for yourself, but to be prevented because of these systemic structures that have allowed private banks to really shirk their responsibility for getting capital back into our communities. And I also want to note that if you're living in Birmingham, for example, you're paying taxes. I'm sure you're paying, property taxes. All of those dollars, they're going to that city. And what are you getting in return? And I ask this for every person in every city. But Brian, what are you getting for the taxes that you pay?
Well, this is gonna always frustrate people who are local. If my mayor, Randall Woodfin, my city councilman, John Hilliard, if my county commissioners do not speak up, I will be going to the county and I will be asking for all of my taxes to be lowered to $0. If they think this appraisal is just, I'm asking them to lower my taxes on all 8 buildings to $0. And then I'm gonna ask them to lower everybody else's properties to $0 who has similar buildings to me in Inslee. I should not be paying taxes for the local school system, the local county, the local city, or the state if they will not speak up for me for my buildings. If they will not speak up for me, they're not speaking up for the community. And I believe this community has the same right to sue the city, to sue the county, to sue the bank, to sue the appraisal company for if they do not speak up. And the reason why I mention this is because there's an attorney 1 block away from me. And I believe other people need to know what he has done to put pressure on the city of Birmingham and large institutions. He sued the city of Birmingham several years ago because they left their buildings dilapidated around him. And they said, okay, all right, if your buildings are dilapidated around me and you're not doing anything with them, you're pulling my property value down. So he's won that lawsuit every time. And I believe others need to be able to use that same situation, because right around me, there's several other city buildings that is owned and they are doing nothing. I got grass 6 feet high next door to me. And, but the reason why I'm mentioning that, because if a bank intentionally devalue my property and the appraisal company devalue my property, that means my properties can't develop. So that means the appraisals for or the value of the properties around me doesn't go up. So that means they can sue them for, we can create a class action lawsuit if we have to, because they are hurting all of our values. We need our politicians to speak up. All I care about is fairness, equality, improving our community, creating office spaces for our young Black men and women to get off of these streets and create mentoring programs in this community and show people that we can create a successful, thriving community. And I would love to do it with government, but if government doesn't do their part, I definitely will be going very shortly asking all of my property values, all of my taxes to be lowered to $0 since they won't speak up for my $0 appraisal.
That is a very strong statement and one that I think resonates with folks around the country. The question of what are you getting for your tax dollars? Is the government and are your public institutions speaking up and standing up for you as a resident and as a taxpayer? I will say that the Public Banking Institute, these are the sorts of issues that with the town halls, we would love to be able to support, because other residents, I'm sure, need to hear the statement. They need to hear what's happening, and they also need to know that there are some solutions that can help address the issues that you've raised. I'm really curious to see if the administration, if the local administration there in Birmingham is responsive, and has anyone reached out to you throughout this process?
Well, every last one of them knows me personally. I was friends with them, I say all of them, before I bought my properties. One thing I would say about the history of the United States of America, when people own land, things change. The moment I bought these properties, those who were friends of me in leadership made my life become super political, because I know I bought properties in a prime area that is set up for gentrification. And I know we can restore this community. I've seen it done all around the country. And I've had the head of economic development reach out. I saw him a few weeks ago, and he said, "Oh, I saw your story, or the BBC story," and that's all he said. And then there's a person with NCRC who's local, who's a developer 1 block away. He said he was going to set up a banking summit because with NCRC, which addresses redlining issues around the country, he said he was going to, and this is in the room with the mayor, with the head of economic development, all of the city councilmen, where we're going to bring in the FDIC, the comptroller of the current currency, and the Federal Reserve, because this is so un-American that it should not happen, is the words that he said. And they use my case to get large projects approved for them when they ask for, so what about the banking values in Inslee? And then they use those statements, but then they never go through and push those other things through to actually help. So I'm hoping they stand up. I have no issue with them. I have an issue with unfair banking and unfair lending. Just do right. That's all I care about. Yeah,
that's absolutely it. And I think that's the message that I hope sticks with all of our viewers and with everyone that comes in contact with you.
Yes, I wanted to I let this go long. This has been just such an emotional and important conversation, and it's really making me choke up. So I really want both of you to know how important it is to me. And I think that makes me so angry to know my friends are facing these issues.
I've cried many times.
So I do want to just emphasize, if people want to do a town hall around the country and help this in their communities, please get in contact with the Public Banking Institute. We are more than happy to help you set those up. I think controlling credit is a key part of democracy. Understanding your own where money is put into the communities is central, and it empowers all of us when we have that. And I applaud both of you for bringing this to the forefront and having this conversation today, and I'm deeply grateful. We are, just for the viewers, we are doing these live shows hopefully at least once every other week, might be once a week, and please watch for them. The notice, in 2 weeks we will have Ellen Brown Ask Me Anything, so we will have with our chair, and you can ask her any questions. What else? I think that's about it. I want to, if you have any last words, do you want to add in what your last frame of this is, Amara?
Sure. Well, I want to thank Brian. Thank you so much for your openness, for talking about your experience, and for the passion that you're bringing to this work. This is really, it is absolutely crucial, this moment that we're in as a country and even around the world, these are the conversations that we have to have, and also the solutions that we're offering that can really address some of these generations long issues of discrimination that we have seen, and we're experiencing the results of that. So I definitely want to offer myself as a resource. I know the Public Banking Institute is more than happy to assist as you move forward in your advocacy efforts, engaging with elected officials, engaging with the other folks down in Birmingham, whether through town halls or any other support that we can provide. I'm definitely on board with that, and just with you in the fight. I really just want to thank you for sharing your story.
Well, definitely, thank you. So as I close, I'm gonna share one other thing that I learned through this process. My auntie reached out to me and she said, "Brian, do you know in the 1930s, your great grandfather lost his property because of how they were taking African American properties throughout the country?" And when and then she said he essentially died from depression not too much longer later. So this is not just in this generation, this is several generations back. So to me, it's just important that we realize this is not a Birmingham only thing. I saw it in Milwaukee, I saw it in Charlotte, I saw it when I lived in Houston, I saw it when I lived in Knoxville, and now I'm back in Birmingham, and it is across the country. I recommend people to reach out and send letters to their congressman. Matter of fact, if you want to just reach out to me and send me a letter, I will send it to your congressman, or I send it directly to Maxine Waters. And my website is Brian, BrianKRice.com. We have to bring awareness to this, and we need our elected officials to be one of the loudest voices. But then if they never step up, we as citizens and regular people, we have to invest in our communities and improve them, and we can do it.
Yes, indeed.
Okay, thank you both very much, and we'll see you in 2 weeks' time on the next PBI Live.
Thank you.
Thank you.